Hi, everybody. This is Mark, and welcome back to Beyond Profit, a global perspective. I want to talk about Bad Bunny's halftime Super Bowl performance last night. It was controversial from the start. Soon as it was announced, the NFL was defending it because President Trump was attacking it. Turning Point USA came up with an alternate agenda, an alternate Super Bowl show involving Kid Rock and some conservative and country artists. Just in case you were so offended by Bad Bunny, you had to go someplace else in order to watch the rest of it. Part of the controversy involved this notion that he was going to be singing in Spanish and he somehow wasn't American enough, even though Puerto Rico, of course, is a territory of the United States and Bad Bunny is a U.S. citizen. And, of course, Bad Bunny entered the controversy himself as well, long before he even was invited to the Super Bowl, as the Department of Homeland Security threatened to post people around his concerts. He decided that he wasn't going to go tour in America anymore because he was afraid that his fans might be vulnerable. And, of course, he also made a pretty strong anti-ICE statement at the Grammy Awards the previous week. And so a lot of people were wondering, okay, Bad Bunny's now on one of the biggest stages of the world. Is he going to say anything? Whatever you thought of his performance, it does raise some interesting questions. The first one is, why would the NFL go forward with this in the first place? I mean, it's super controversial. The NFL doesn't usually like controversy. Last time Colin Kaepernick took a knee, he was pretty much blackballed from the league, and there was a lot of controversy around all of that. I mean, this seems like, I don't know if it's a bigger deal, but it certainly has drawn a lot of fire. Why did they stick with it? Why did they even choose it in the first place? Second interesting question, I think, is, was the performance actually political? And it could be looked at a few different ways, so let's look at it. And the third question is, what importance is there to this moment and this particular performance, and whether or not Bad Bunny has influence? Because as you know, I study the influence of celebrities on politics and how that affects the whole business entertainment environment. And so that's what we want to talk about here. So let's do it. I want to thank all of you out there for watching this video, for supporting this channel. Please like, share, subscribe, leave some comments below. I'm really curious to know what you thought of that performance and how political you think it was and what the impact of it might be. So please feel free to share that in the comments below. All right, so let's take some of these questions here in turn. First question is, why would the NFL come up with this idea in the first place? And I think the most straightforward, simple answer originally was they have been thinking about global branding for a long time. Think about all of the international games they have held over the last few years. American team against American team, of course, but in different parts of the world. Why are they doing that? They want to expand their global reach. I mean, I'm sure they would be really, really excited to have some international team join the NFL. I don't know if that's part of their agenda or not, but just to get an international audience that excited about American football, that's a long-term goal for them. And so anything they can do to draw attention to this uniquely American sport that really isn't played professional in much other parts of the world, I mean, this is really the big game, they want to have people pay attention to that. And if you look at Bad Bunny, he has been the top streaming performer on Spotify in 4 out of the past 6 years, which means he's big in America, sure, but he is big around the world. And because he's not speaking English, he's singing in Spanish, it's outreach to communities of people who might really be attracted to that. Think about the really, really strong fan base that soccer, or as the rest of the world calls it, football, as opposed to American football, the kind of devotion that people in South and Central America have to that sport. American football, the NFL would love to try to grab those fans. Now, as for why they stuck with him, that's a question that I probably can only guess at. My thought is that maybe they didn't realize the cultural firestorm that they were wandering into, and at a certain point, you just can't back down. If you embrace Bad Bunny and then you say, on the other hand, the next day, oh, sorry, we're just going to drop him, what is that going to do to that potential audience that you're trying to attract in the first place? And so I think it ends up becoming a risky move for them to stick with Bad Bunny, but they did it anyway. And my guess is the payoff probably is going to exceed the risk, but we'll see what happens here in the future. That's just my guess. Never great at predictions, but hey, I'm trying here, right? So let's talk about number 2 then. So was the performance political? And my answer to that is yes, but subjectively. I'm not sure that it looked the same to everyone, and the way people interpreted that event, I think, really depends on people's identity and some of the symbols that have been employed. Already we've talked about the fault lines, the cultural fault lines between those people who were in favor of Bad Bunny performing versus those who were against. And if you look at just the fact that he went forward, he was part of that performance, and he was criticized by President Trump, which means inherently he's potentially threatening, there are some lines being drawn. The fact that he was mentioned in the first place meant that he would himself become a symbol, potentially threatening symbol, because that's sort of part of Trump's MO, right? Choose people who are doing things that he doesn't like or doesn't represent what he thinks is right about America, and then as a symbol that becomes potentially threatening to those people who are on his side and potentially solidifies his base. The very fact that he is talking about him in this way means that he may feel potentially threatened in some real sense by Bad Bunny, and there's some precedence for this. President Nixon was constantly concerned about John Lennon, and Lennon was an immigrant in the United States. He had a green card, he wanted to become a U.S. citizen, and he also was extremely outspoken, very politically involved, was actually organizing with Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman and some of the big 1960s youth protesters and organizers, and their idea was to try to create a series of concerts in order to try to take Richard Nixon and put him out of the picture. And Nixon was worried about this. He basically sent the FBI out to investigate John Lennon, and then sicked the whole judicial system against him to try to make it difficult for him to stay in America because he had a green card, and drew out this very, very long legal process so that it absorbed a lot of his time and prevented him from really getting more aggressive in terms of his political involvement. And a lot of this is very similar to the sorts of actions and threats and so on we see with Donald Trump today. This whole notion of symbols and identity has been documented in the academic literature. Like if we look at Murray Edelman's symbolic use of politics, for example, what he argues is that symbols, these sort of abstract things that represent feelings and groups and so on, they can be very, very powerful. And one symbol presents a sense of threat to one group of people, the same symbol can represent a sense of reassurance to another. If we were to take an American flag and run it down any main street USA, people would think, hey, that's a nice patriotic guy. If you were to do exactly the same thing down the streets of Kandahar, you'd probably get a slightly different response. Different groups respond to the same images in different ways because they personally identify with certain symbols, and it animates certain identities. So when I see an American flag, it makes me feel like an American. Those people who are not Americans, who may be threatened by that, see it as a potential threat. And so it brings out those differences and the potential for conflict between those people. And so you can kind of see that happening as President Trump is sort of singling out Bad Bunny, because it is also possible for a person to be a symbol, just as Bad Bunny may be a reassurance to those who are Hispanic or people who already are inclined toward a diversity agenda. He is seen as threatening to people who do not. Trump himself functions as a symbol, as presidents frequently do. It doesn't matter whether people know him personally or even know that much about his personal politics. People have visceral feelings about that. And people on the left tend to feel very threatened by him, and people on the right tend to feel very, very reassured by him. So going back to the Super Bowl performance, it's important to point out that there's not any explicit political statements made. There's nothing said in terms of like a clear agenda, you ought to go do this or anything. It wasn't like that. But if you look at it from a symbolic perspective and you look at the way people might have interpreted the event, then it is profoundly political. So let's take apart some of those bits and figure out, like, in what way is this the case. So take this statement: the only thing more powerful than hate is love. It's one of the first things you see or notice in this performance. Normally it's sort of innocuous. It's a statement that in most situations people would just say, oh yeah, I agree with that, that's fine. But in the context of Bad Bunny's performance, it may be perceived by some on the right as sort of an uncomfortable thing that's being said, particularly since a lot of these people support the immigration agenda that targets minorities. And you can argue that, okay, sure, maybe there is a legal basis to try to pull people out of the country who are here illegally, but the way in which it is done has made a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And I think this message probably may make some people feel a little bit uncomfortable if that's the direction that they're leaning in the first place. Then we have the statement on the football at the end: together we are America. Again, fairly innocuous statement, no big deal. It's something that a lot of people would agree with a lot of the time. But consider this: the performance is almost all in Spanish, and that was sort of a point of controversy before. And the government, since Trump has come into office, has been trying to eliminate all sorts of Spanish translation, from government documents to displays to programs. And so the fact that the Super Bowl that the halftime show is almost all in Spanish is in itself sort of something that, like, comes against a lot of people's notion of what "together we are America" really means. If you are on the right, you might have some qualms about all of this being in Spanish, and maybe that shouldn't be included in terms of our American identity. The message is also broadly inclusive, which runs counter to a lot of people's attitudes toward diversity. DEI programs, diversity, equity, inclusiveness programs, the government and many big businesses have been trying to eliminate them. And so for those who are in favor of that kind of thing, this statement also sort of implies some potential threat to them. You might also have noticed people bearing flags and running around with them around the stadium. Well, these flags, many of them were from different countries in the Western Hemisphere, suggesting a more pan-American identity, this idea that what it means for us to be together as Americans may not just be people with U.S. citizenship, but people in North and South America as well, and that maybe Latinos around the world should perhaps identify with this notion of being American, which may be separate but also inclusive of the United States itself. Again, this isn't a picture of America that Trump supports. Plus, this was a huge celebration of Latin culture, and particularly Puerto Rican culture. Remembering, as I said before, that Puerto Rico is technically connected to the United States, and the people who live there are American citizens. So when we say "together we're Americans," we're including Puerto Rican people as well, which is another interesting point. The flag that Bad Bunny at one point had was not actually the official flag of Puerto Rico, but the flag of Puerto Rican independence, which also sort of an implicit argument, perhaps for Puerto Rican independence, although nobody comes out and says that explicitly. Speaking of something that nobody came out and said explicitly, there's also the moment where Bad Bunny hands the Grammy Award to the little boy who's watching Bad Bunny on TV. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind on this, right? He's watching Bad Bunny's Grammy acceptance speech that just happened the previous week, and what does Bad Bunny say during this speech? He says, "Ice out," which was a blatantly direct political statement. So whereas you do not hear him say it, you actually see him say it, or at least in that speech anyway, at that event, at that time, a specific reminder to what his position is on this. And by handing this trophy to the boy, his argument is that this boy represents him as a child, and so it's kind of a neat, hey, future me, here, I'm handing this award to past me. But other people have looked at this differently. Does this represent Latin American youth or youth across America, whoever you are, and the potential that you have to achieve great things? Maybe it's that. Is this a message to dreamers, kids who were illegally brought to the United States and reside here and hope for the protections of legal U.S. citizenship. And here's something that happened that I think was unintentional, but it happened anyway. And that is, there was a social media buzz about the possibility that this kid might be Liam Conejo Ramos, who was a little boy who was abducted by ICE, held at their facility, and then eventually freed. It was a little boy who had guess what, a bunny hat on, right? And so a lot of people were like, oh, it's the kid, that's who it is, and he put him in the Super Bowl performance. Well, it wasn't that kid. But does it matter if it is that kid or not? Because at this moment, a lot of people believed it was, or perhaps symbolically it was meant to represent that kid. Was this a deliberate political statement? I don't think that I can read somebody's mind and figure out what their intentions are, but I will say that it was interpreted as a political statement for sure, which again created a sense of reassurance in terms of that symbol to people on the left, but potentially a sense of threat to people on the other side. So my final question is there any importance to this? And that's the thing that I like to study, right? Does it really matter? Can celebrities, or in this case musicians, really change people's minds? Well, I will say, as I've talked about in a previous video, there's a strong connection between emotions and music. And so certain kinds of music can affect people's attitudes and behaviors. It can certainly affect their feelings. And even when you're watching a show, you can still be carried away from that moment, with that moment. You can feel very emotional about it. But whether or not that broadly affects everyone, I think, is anybody's question. If we look at it from the lens of symbolic politics and social identity theory, then when you have in-groups and out-groups, my assumption would be that people who watched it, who didn't agree with Bad Bunny and his politics and looked at some of these symbols as potentially threatening, it's probably not going to change their minds. And those people who, on the other hand, already were supportive of this and like this whole inclusiveness message, well, their minds probably aren't going to be changed either. They may feel stronger, they may feel emboldened, they may feel more emotional, they may feel like, hey, there's somebody out there who's big, who is on our side, and seeing all these people at the Super Bowl cheering for them, it may validate their feelings. All of that is very true. But there also may be some people in the middle who are swayed one direction or another by the emotion of the moment, or by the way that all of this is portrayed. Or perhaps those people knee-jerk and say, hey, it's all too much, and you sent me the other direction. That's an area where you really need data, and that's what I don't have. So I can't really give you an answer on that, but I can give you a sense of that analysis that it could possibly matter. It could make a difference because it really was a significant event. If you think about Bad Bunny sort of being a huge, groundbreaking Grammy performer as a Puerto Rican, and then to appear at the Super Bowl around the same time, that is going to be a cultural moment, I think, that will be memorable for a long, long time. So that's my take on the situation. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.